So, the world's biggest and most important climate conference, COP30, just wrapped up in Belém, Brazil, right there at the mouth of the Amazon. And get this, the entire philosophy of the summit, its whole vibe, might just come down to one single powerful Brazilian word. What is this word? And how could it possibly change the game in our long fight against climate change? More importantly, what actually went down in those negotiation rooms? Chalo, let's unpack it.
And here it is, mutirão. Now, this isn't just some catchy slogan for a brochure. In Brazil, this is a real, deep cultural idea. Picture this, a neighbor's house needs to be built, so the entire village just shows up, no questions asked, to raise it together. That's a mutirão. It's about everyone coming together to achieve something huge that no one could do alone. And Brazil's big idea for COP30 was to inject this exact spirit into global climate talks, to shift from a few powerful people making deals behind closed doors to a massive, all-hands-on-deck effort.
So, here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll get the basics down. What exactly is a COP? Then we'll get into why the stakes were so incredibly high in Belém. We'll look at the key players and the mind-boggling sums of money involved, before digging into the big wins and the action plans that came out of it. We'll also tackle the massive elephant in the room, fossil fuels, and India's crucial role in that whole debate. And finally, we'll ask the most important question: what happens now? All right, let's get into it.
All right, Section 1. What is COP30 anyway? First things first, we hear this acronym COP thrown around in the news every single year. It sounds super official, super complicated, but what does it actually mean? And why should we care? Let's just get the basics straight.
So, COP simply stands for Conference of the Parties. You can think of it as the annual board meeting for planet Earth. See, back in 1992, almost every country in the world signed a huge treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. It had one massive goal: to stabilize the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere to prevent a total climate catastrophe. The parties are just the countries who signed up, and every year since 1995, they've met to try and figure out, okay, how are we actually going to do this?
This timeline, man, it really tells the story of how our global conversation on climate has grown up. Look, it started in Kyoto back in '97, where the responsibility was put on developed nations, the ones who'd been polluting for over a century. But the game completely changed in Paris in 2015. That was huge. For the first time, every country, rich or poor, had to bring its own climate plan to the table. Then you see the conversation getting more real. By 2022, we were finally admitting the damage is already happening and we need a loss and damage fund for it. And just last year in Dubai, after decades of avoiding the F word, they finally agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. Each step has built on the last, bringing us to Belém, where the pressure was to finally act on all these promises.
Section 2. Why Belém was so important. So, with almost 30 of these meetings already done, what made this one so special? Why all the hype? Well, it comes down to a critical deadline, a hugely symbolic location, and some frankly terrifying science.
This conference was a massive deal because it was the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. Remember that? Where the world agreed on that life-or-death goal, keep global warming well below 2 degrees, and really push for 1.5. So COP30 was the big 10-year report card. And let me tell you, the results were not good. The science is clear, we are way off track and dangerously close to blowing past that 1.5-degree limit for good.
And this number, this is the reason for the panic. Let's be very clear. This is not some doomsday worst-case scenario. According to the UN's own analysis, this is where we're headed even if every country keeps the promises they've already made. A world that's 2.3 to 2.8 degrees warmer, that's a world with even more brutal heat waves in Delhi, more devastating floods in Kerala, and irreversible damage to our food and water. This is the massive, terrifying gap that leaders in Belém were staring at. It is the gap between talk and action.
So, the question on everyone's mind was simple and urgent. How on earth were they going to close this gap? What was the actual plan to pull us back from the brink?
The agenda they set was huge. First job, take that failing report card from the last COP and create a real comeback plan. That meant getting deadly serious about tripling renewable energy globally by 2030, which in turn meant they had to finally talk about the real money needed to fund this, especially for developing countries. But it's not just about cutting emissions. You also have to focus on adaptation, helping countries prepare for the climate impacts that are already here. And by setting it all in Belém, the message was loud and clear. Nature itself, especially the Amazon, had to be a central part of the solution.
Section 3. The key players and pledges.
A summit like this is all about who's in the room and what they're willing to put on the table, especially when it comes to promises and, of course, money. So let's look at who showed up and the eye-watering financial pledges being negotiated. First up, the host. Brazil went all out. In a massive symbolic move, President Lula da Silva temporarily shifted the entire national capital from Brasilia to Belém for the conference. This wasn't just for show. It was a powerful statement that, for Brazil, protecting the Amazon and leading on climate was a top national priority. The man with the impossible job of getting everyone to agree was the experienced Brazilian diplomat, Ambassador André Correia do Lago.
And it's so important to understand that this wasn't just a room full of politicians. Yes, 193 countries were there, but the real energy, the real pressure often comes from outside the official rooms. You had thousands of activists from NGOs demanding faster action. You had indigenous leaders from the Amazon and all over the world sharing generations of knowledge. You had the world's top scientists laying out the hard, undeniable facts. And critically, you had the big players from the private sector, the banks and corporations who hold the keys to financing this whole thing.
Now, let's talk money, because this number is the source of so much bad blood and mistrust. Years ago, back in 2009, wealthy nations made a landmark promise. They would provide $100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries. It was meant to be a foundation of trust, and they broke that promise. This failure shattered trust and created a huge us versus them divide that poisoned all future talks.
So, coming into the new negotiations, everyone knew that $100 billion was not only a broken promise, but it was also just not enough to get the job done. So they didn't just nudge the goal up, they went for a moonshot. The new target is a staggering $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. Now, this isn't just government aid, it's the total investment needed from everyone, public and private, to re-engineer our entire global economy.
Section 4. Big wins and action plans. Okay, so the stage was set. The massive financial targets were on the table. So what actually happened? After all the late nights and tense negotiations, what did they manage to agree on? Let's look at the concrete outcomes meant to finally turn all this talk into action.
This table shows the evolution perfectly. Dubai in 2023 was about assessment. That global stocktake was basically a giant audit of where we stand. And the answer was not good. Belém was all about the what next. The focus shifted to implementation, to the muturon, and to putting nature at the center. And just look at the finance column. In Dubai, they talked vaguely about an enhanced framework. In Belém, they put a hard number on it, tripling that funding by 2035. And they finally locked in that massive $1.3 trillion roadmap.
So what were the big wins? First, they created the Berlin mechanism for just global transition. This is vital, because you can't just shut down a coal mine without a plan for the thousands of workers who depend on it. This is about making sure the green transition is fair. Next, the bioeconomy challenge, a big push to create wealth from sustainable natural resources, not from polluting. A huge tangible win was the over $6.7 billion raised for the Tropical Forests Forever facility. And crucially, they adopted a new gender action plan, because the evidence is clear. When women lead on climate action, the results are simply better.
Section 5. Fossil fuels and India's stand. But for all the progress on things like forests and finance, there was a giant oil-slicked elephant in the room that they just couldn't agree on. We have to talk about fossil fuels and the critical position of a major player like India.
This was, for many people, the single biggest failure of the summit. After that historic agreement in Dubai to transition away from fossil fuels, everyone hoped Belém would provide the how, the actual detailed roadmap, but it didn't happen. The divide was just too wide. Major oil and gas producing nations like Saudi Arabia and Russia pushed back hard against any plan for a clear phase-out. It just highlights the brutal geopolitics at the heart of all this.
So where did India stand? India positioned itself as a powerful leader of the developing world, with a few very clear points. First, finance first. The message was simple. Don't ask us for more action until you've delivered on your old money promises. Second, they pushed to make this the COP of adaptation, arguing that for countries like ours, preparing for disasters is just as important. Third, and at the core of everything, was climate justice. The simple idea that everyone has to help clean up the mess, but the people who made the most mess for the longest time have to do the most cleaning. And finally, India pushed back hard against what it calls green protectionism, things like the EU's carbon border tax, which it sees as unfair.
Section 6, the long road from Belém. And so, the conference is over. The delegates have flown home, the headlines have moved on. What happens now? What was it all for?
Where do we go from here?
And this is the most important takeaway of all. The agreements signed in Belém are ultimately just pieces of paper. The real Mutiran, the real collective effort begins now. The focus must shift from the grand conference halls to our own countries, our states, our cities, and our communities. It's now up to every government, every company, and every one of us to take these global goals and turn them into local action. Because the success of COP30 won't be measured in headlines, but in the tons of carbon we actually keep out of the atmosphere.
So there you have it, the high-stakes world of COP30. From the inspiring spirit of Mutirão to the trillion-dollar finance goals and the unresolved bitter fight over fossil fuels. If you want to dig even deeper and really get a handle on all this, head over to our website. We've put together detailed notes from this entire explainer and a free, easy-to-use mind map to help you lock in all the key info. The link is right there in the description. Thanks for watching.